I'm hoping you're having a wonderful conference, and my thoughts have been with you since yesterday. And I see some really lovely people. I see a nice ribbon skirt in the room, and I'm just so excited for you that you're having this time together to chat through some of these ideas and then follow up from last year. I know that sometimes we have these events and it's kind of a one-off, and having that continuity is such a beautiful way to carry on this work. So as I said, I'm joining you from Treaty 1 territory. I live on Lake Winnipeg, kind of at the place where the mouth of the river, the Winnipeg River, is. So that's in Anishinaabe referred to as Saugeen, or the place where the water opens up, or the river opens up into the lake. In English, it's called Traverse Bay. And so you see that there's all these references to water, and water is very much the work that I do. And you see this image in front of you on my opening slide, and that's actually part of a ceremony on the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm going to get into why I think these connections that we make internationally are so important, and how I think we can work together to support each other and inspire each other. And so for those reasons, I'm super regretful that I can't be there in person, but I hope that we'll find ways to carry on the dialogue, and would love to hear more about how your conference is going. We'll save some time for questions today too, so maybe some of you can tell me what's going on in the room. So we'll switch slides to the outline. I'm going to share a little bit about our Decolonizing Water project. Just to be clear, we're not decolonizing water itself. We're decolonizing ourselves in our relationships with water and trying to encourage that for others. And that's a big partnership that we have with a variety of different nations, organizations, individuals, researchers. And then I'm going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about some of the land back and governance back work that we've done through Decolonizing Water. And then talk about a couple kind of case studies or things that have been happening within the Lake Winnipeg watershed. And lastly, I'm going to invite you to be part of a dialogue on building a water treaty. And that's within the Lake Winnipeg watershed. And some of you will say, okay, treaty, wow, you're taking water, decolonization, Indigenous law, and treaty, bringing it all together. And in so many ways, for me, that's like all of my life's work coming to these intersecting points. And I think it's so exciting because, like probably many of you, you have those moments where you think, okay, why am I doing what I'm doing? Why am I on this path? Or why did I meet this person? Why did I do this piece of work? And when you see them come together, that becomes really exciting. And my good friend, Bonnie Healy, she's Blackfoot from Alberta, and she always says, my Siri's going off, I don't know why. She's having fun in the background here. But my good friend Bonnie likes to say it's because we've got all these ancestors. So they're always standing with us, behind us, and they're helping to direct us. Apparently, Alexa thinks that's for today. So that's my plan for the short time that we have together. And like I said, the conversation can hopefully continue from there. We'll go forward one slide. So these are my books. And often people will come up to me and say, I read your book. And I'm like, oh, which one? Because they're all so different. But you can see just by looking at the covers is each and every one of them is engaged with water in some way. And that's kind of that guiding theme. So from reconciliation to treaties to thinking about hydroelectric development and its impact on nations in northern Manitoba, all of it kind of centers around water. Change slide to thinking about it in that decolonial context. So as I said, not us decolonizing water, but decolonizing ourselves and others in relationship to that water. Next slide. So this is like the sky-high view of my territory. And the reason I show you this is the South Basin of Lake Winnipeg. It's the 10th largest freshwater lake in the world. So a lot of you think of big lakes as the big lakes and or the Great Lakes as the big lakes, but this is a pretty important one. And this is where I live. So right on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see kind of a river that's heading towards the lake. That's the Winnipeg River, and I live right at the mouth of that river. And I show you this kind of to situate where I'm from, where I grew up, who my people are, but also to show how I see my responsibility, how I see my jurisdiction, who am I responsible to, but also thinking about the land and water that I'm responsible to. So this is where I belong. And that means that I have sets of responsibilities. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that I'm not the only one that has sets of responsibilities within this vast territory. So this map shows you the Lake Winnipeg watershed. So I'm way on the right-hand side. You can see the big lakes, the one on the right at the mouth of the Winnipeg River. That's where I am. But this extends to the Rocky Mountains into 4 Canadian provinces, 4 American states. So this water is crossing the border. We share this water, and this is the second largest watershed in Canada, and it involves a significant number of people in a variety of different ways. What's also interesting is this is the 3rd largest hydroelectric reservoir in the world. So Manitoba Hydro uses this particular lake and its flows, including water that flows from the Rocky Mountains and glaciers into this lake, and uses it as a reservoir to control how much water gets pushed through a series of hydroelectric dams in northern Manitoba. So I'm not going to talk about hydro today, but if anybody asks me a question, I'll be very happy to talk about it. It's something that I've been passionate about for a very long time and have worked with a lot of First Nations in Manitoba on. I also work a lot with nations in the north, so outside of this watershed, and in the Seal River watershed. And they're doing some very cool stuff. If you're going to take one note today, Seal River watershed, go see what they're doing. They are allying between the Dene and Cree within their territory to protect a totally intact watershed. So the Seal River is pristine. The watershed is pristine, and they have now an agreement with the federal and provincial governments, government of Manitoba, to not issue any mineral exploration licenses. So there's a full moratorium within their territory, and they're working together to develop legal principles based on their own Indigenous legal orders to govern their relationship to that territory. So very exciting what they're doing, and they're working through the mechanism of an Indigenous protected area, which is it's becoming more common in Canada, and there's actually quite a bit of funding and federal policy to provide resources to that. I don't know if it's the same in the States, if that's picking up steam, but definitely something that's happening within the Canadian territory. And that tends to be married with Guardians programs. So some of you may have heard about Indigenous protected areas and Guardians programs working hand in hand. And that seems to be an evolving trend within our territory. And an exciting one, I think, because it's building on, in large part, Indigenous legal orders, sets of principles, values, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous science. And it means like being on and with the land and water. So we'll flip slides here. This is a different map of the Lake Winnipeg watershed, just to show you kind of the flow, where all this water is coming from and where it's headed to. So these nations I was talking about in northern Manitoba, they're the ultimate recipients of this water as it heads towards the Hudson's Bay. So very interesting spot. And, I was very excited to come to the conference and be there with you, also because I wanted to go. This is my tradition when I come into your territory. I always go put my feet in the headwaters of the Mississippi, because I think it's just so cool that my water is heading to the Arctic. And then, that connects me right until the Gulf of Mexico. And I just think water is so amazing and powerful and has the ability to connect us all. And most people don't even realize, when they're in those spaces. So, I'll do that next time I come and visit. So flipping slides again, I don't want to, this is the part where I'm afraid somebody's eyes are going to glaze over because I'm talking about law and I don't want to lose anybody. I'll try and keep it, interesting. And this is, I'll tell you how I think about law and legal orders and the concept of jurisdiction. I think, Indigenous people around the world, and especially in North America right now, are in this kind of middle space of dealing with state law, international law, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and our own Indigenous laws and legal orders. And how we navigate that is tricky and it's different in these different contexts, but that's sort of the situation that we find ourselves in. And so jurisdiction becomes really important. Which set of laws apply? And within that, who gets to decide? Who gets to decide about what and in which territory? So that concept of jurisdiction actually becomes really key when we're thinking about exercising things like self-determination or self-governance or working, within our own tribes or nations, and thinking about what we can do, what we should do, what we have a responsibility to do. And so I use this slide not to kind of make it overly complicated, but to actually bring us into what it is that we're busy doing. And it's big work. It's very challenging at times, but it's also very rewarding. And it's part of that, that set of things that, in my view, our ancestors have given us to do in these next generations. And why is it important? Well, on the next slide, I'm going to, I'll show you some pictures that I think some of you might recognize. It's critically important because we have in this middle picture, we have what I call a conflict of laws. We have state law, trespass, civil disobedience. And on the other side, we have water protectors taking up responsibilities that they have in relation to Nibin or any form of water, whether it's Zibi or Zibing, it's lakes and rivers, it's all these different forms of water, salt water, fresh water, birth water. A lot of birth workers are doing this really important work around birth and water as well. And that's stuff that I'm tied to. But these systems are coming into clash. And some people talk about, harmonization of laws. But if those have different sets of values that underlie them, how much can we harmonize? Or do we have to start thinking about the conflict that exists and which ones, which sets of laws we privilege in different contexts? And how we develop intersocietal law around that, thinking about where that harmonization can take place and where that resistance needs to continue to exist. And in Canada, next slide, I'm hoping you see a slide that says reconciliation, TRC. Yeah, we're still on the same page here. Okay. In Canada, we've been fortunate to have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that gave us a set of directions, calls to action. But one of the things I think is most powerful is what they tell us about reconciliation. And Heidi Stark and Hokulani Aikau and I wrote this, or edited this book and wrote chapters within it, kind of challenging the concept of reconciliation. But what the TRC tells us is it's this establishment and maintenance of mutually respectful relationships, which I think is relational is, I think, important when you're thinking about Indigenous laws and legal orders and Indigenous self-determination. But the last sentence in the slide here tells us that there's an imperative of real societal change. And that's the space in which we're working now. And how do we give effect to that? And the TRC also told us, UNDRIP, this Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is that cornerstone for reconciliation. Reconciliation can be problematic, and we could debate that a bunch. But I think these kind of two core principles that attach to that are incredibly important. And if you look at the Declaration on the next slide, I've included Article 25. And this, to me, this is the most exciting part of New. There's so many good things about it. There's so many challenges with implementation. We have federal legislation in Canada that tells us that the federal government should be implementing it, but courts say different things. And so it's a tool, like many others, but this particular section speaks to the distinctive spiritual relationship that Indigenous people have with lands, territories, waters, and coastal areas. Not just the relationship, but the idea that it's that there's a right to uphold those responsibilities for future generations. And I think that's incredibly important as we think about upholding Indigenous laws, especially in relation to land and water, that these are about spiritual relationships and that we have these obligations into the future. And in light of some of this, I work very closely with the David Suzuki Foundation, which in Canada it's kind of a big deal. Suzuki Foundation does a lot of work on environmental issues and has worked very closely trying to reconcile environmental issues with Indigenous environmental issues in the last few years. So this was part of some of that work, and we worked on 2 reports, Land Back and Governance Back, and we can quickly flip through these slides, but I would highly encourage you to look at the case studies here, because in the Governance Back report, they're looking at these reclamations of governance, different ways of doing that, and noting that there isn't sort of one singular approach to reclaiming that jurisdiction and governance, but that there's a variety of them. So there's some analysis in the report, but I think the case studies themselves are extremely valuable to anyone or any nation who's thinking about doing some of that land back, that reclamation work. And then we also did a report on shared governance and looked at different examples, kind of pushing the boundary of co-management and saying, having a seat at the table as managers is not the same thing as being decision makers. So in spaces where we're going to do shared governance, that's decision making, setting the values and principles, we need to have some examples to help guide that, and to talk about the challenges that many of them have had in doing that work. So that was, I think, important work, and encourage you to have a look at them. But I want to focus more today on some of the initiatives that we've been working on through the Decolonizing Water Project and in kind of my home territory in particular. So if we can start, I have a map of the watershed again. This is slide 16. So we've gone through shared governance. Hopefully you see that map again. And now there's some yellow dots on the map to kind of situate you in the different initiatives that are going on within the territory. And flip slides. The first one that I'd like to talk about is, I would call the foundational work of this project, and it's on Anishinaabe, Nibe, and Okanagan. So working with elders and community to suss out, what is Anishinaabe law in relation to water, and what is Anishinaabe law more generally? How do we think about it? How do we apply it? And what you see here in this image of the Nibe gathering is a small group of us. I think this might have been the first or second gathering. And so this is us sitting by the water. I had all black hair back then. That is, I'm looking at a picture of myself thinking, wow, that was a while ago. But we had this amazing opportunity to share these teachings, to bring people together that were doing water work in many of the ways that the Nibe Center does as well, and to learn from the land, learn from the water. Next slide. And with the elders, we had a faculty of elders. Some of them have left us now, but some of them continue to be part of this gathering. They helped us, understand and develop this framework, this comparative framework of thinking about Anishinaabe, Nakanagewan, or Anishinaabe law as sets of relationships that are centered around well-being. And contrasting that with, what I was able to share about the foundations of state law in the Western legal system, that's very much focused on individualism and the protection of private property. And so when you look at those kind of side by side, and I encourage you on the slide to actually, like, relationships and individualism, they don't match up, right? Very different foundations. Minobumatsuan, or collective well-being and protection of private property, again, like a mismatch. So we've got these different pillars or foundations to these legal orders that make them incompatible. And so that helps, I think, understand why we don't come to the same decisions, we don't work in the same process. That our substantive laws and legal principles are different between the two systems, but how we make decisions is also very different. And if we switch to the next slide, and this one I think has movement in it, so you might have to double click on this. Their relationships are guiding, and they're multilateral. So many of you will be familiar with state law and how it's, usually one party versus another party. If you're a third party interest, you have to make special applications into the legal process. There's only certain things you can do within that process, and it's very adversarial for the most part. And here in Anishinaabe law, or Anishinaabe and Okanagan, we're dealing with relationships that aren't necessarily conflictual. They're reciprocal, they're based on that relationality, but also responsibilities, sets of responsibilities that are either directly engaged or engaged in, by reference. And I mean, we could spend hours on this slide. I would love to talk about Anishinaabe legal theory. Elder Alan White from Whitefish Bay says, if you took Anishinaabe law and packed it into books, you would have a whole library of encyclopedias about Anishinaabe law. And I love that thought, you would never get to all of it in your whole lifetime, that we're all continuously learning about Anishinaabe law. And part of the features of it is that it's applied. So you're not going to read kind of in the same way you would in a code or legislation. You must do this or this is going to happen. We all know that we're taught through stories. We're taught to think through stories and to understand things, the same thing, in different ways over time in different contexts. And that's such a beautiful way of, and it's such a rich and complex way of actually engaging with law. Next slide. What we did with the elders was to develop a set of principles, though, and kind of basic. Each of these has, its own set of encyclopedias that attaches to it. But what we did work on kind of setting as a foundation or a base for Anishinaabe, Nube, and Okanagan was the following: that water has life, that we don't own water, that water has a spirit, it can heal, the relationship that Koyawag have with water, so women having that special responsibility, that we must respect it, and that it has a duality, so it can give, take life, and that it can suffer. So these were the kind of core principles that were developed around the Anishinaabe, Nube, and Okanagan work with the faculty of elders. And that knowledge set the foundations for co-learning. So if you go to the next slide, learning over time on the land and water, and working on the relationship between land and water itself. In the next slide, you can see working with clay vessels and traditional clay pottery workshops, working with fire. So the young men in the right-hand corner are working with the birch bark to actually fire the traditional clay vessels that were made from land within our territory. So we're seeing this really interesting development of interaction between land teaching, water teachings, medicine, and there's so much richness that has come from the Nibe gathering. Maybe some of you in the room have been. I know we've hosted some relatives. If you haven't yet, you're welcome to, and it's usually in the third week of May of every year at what's called in English Bannock Point, but Mantuapi, a place of the expression would be like where the creator sat and created all of life. But it's a beautiful 43-acre site where there's petroforms, some very, very large petroforms as well. And so that is important. If you look at the next slide and you see some scientists, allies that came to the NIBI gathering and participated in what was kind of an art performance. And this art performance was taking some nibe that had been prayed with and using these small clay vessels to place it on the land. And what ultimately ended up being the result of 60 people, about 350 vessels being placed on the land, was the shape of a turtle. And there's so many turtle petroforms in that area. And to see that have happened without any direction, or, it's just the water and land itself that guided us to that shape. And in the next slide, you can see that the following year, when we went to do some work on the lodge, the teaching lodge that you see in the background in the previous slide, when we went to do that, the repair work, we saw that the turtles had hatched all of their eggs right on the site where that petroform with that water had been made. So that connection, that whole connection of what the land is saying, what the water is telling us, and us trying to be responsive as humans, even though we might not understand it. And if we go to the next slide, this shows us that in that system of understanding and how we structure our law and our sets of responsibilities, right at the core of it is those spiritual instructions that we have. And that's absent from most other Western legal systems, because Anishinaabe law will start with spirit, will look to laws of nature, and over time we've developed some customary laws that are responsive to that. And in that last realm, we intervene as humans, and we deliberate, and we make responses, appropriate responses in certain contexts. But it starts from spirit. And most other legal orders will start with a human exercise of deliberation. What do we want to do? What do we want to achieve with our law? And the Anishinaabe response is very different in saying, we're not creating this law without reason. It's in order to respond to these sets of instructions. And so one example of that is on the next slide with the NIBI Declaration of Treaty 3. And this we presented actually at the NIBI Minoan conference a couple of years. That was before the pandemic. Everything feels like a couple years, but it was probably more like 5 years ago. And we shared some of this work that was done in Treaty 3. And this is a declaration, so built on Anishinaabe law in the process of lawmaking that had been used for the making of the Mantuakina Hungewin and other little interventions around the MAI in the health law, in the child welfare law as well. So the process was engaged, the Anishinaabe Hungewin process in Treaty 3, but it also mirrors kind of a core feature of Anishinaabe law, which is voluntary compliance. So this is a declaration, and it's not compelling anyone to do anything that they don't want to do. It's read out kind of in the form of, it's a description, and it's a declaration that says, here are sets of responsibilities, follow them or don't. This is all based on voluntary compliance. And you can go to the NIBI portal and see the curriculum that comes with this. You'll see these signs when you enter Treaty 3 territory. You can also hear on the NIBI portal the Anishinaabe 1 interpretation of the declaration. So all of this was done in ceremony, and even the part of the interpretation. And I don't say translation because the Anishinaabe 1 version is like twice as long as what it would take to read it in English. So it's very rich and robust. And I think it's a really amazing and beautiful thing to listen to. I know that there's some kids that come to the NIBI gathering that told me that they listen to it on a regular basis and it's helped their language learning. And I find that really exciting as a direct result of that. And incorporation of art too, right? This logo that we have for the NIBI Declaration is done by Danielle Morrison, who's from Yungashing in Treaty 3, and it represents all of the principles that are here. And sitting with Elder White, we talked for a long time. He told me basically everything that was in the declaration by looking at just the image itself. And those are based on a lot of the pictographs that are found on Lake of the Woods. Again, that connects us into some of your territory as well. The next couple of slides we can go through pretty quickly. One was the Thunderbird foundation of the principles, how they organized around that teaching of the Thunderbird, how the Treaty 3 elders came together to share those teachings that were the foundation, and that we then had a national forum to go through a ratification process. And if I was there in person, I probably would have brought you the big poster to sign. We have hundreds of signatures and support for the declaration. And this was passed in 2019 at the National Assembly. So ratified unanimously by all of the nations in Treaty 3. So I'll take a quick breath here and maybe a sip of water. I really love this work that we did with Treaty 3, and hope that it can help to inspire some of the good work that others are doing as well. And to say that it was inspired by some of the work that people like Sue Chiblo and Deb McGregor are doing with Chiefs of Ontario and many others. I also look to your Minoan Declaration as something, I often talk about it as, like a recentering of our relative as the rights holder, rather than thinking through human rights frameworks, which I think is really important and interesting. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go into Cree laws, which was a lot of fun to work with the Mississippic Cree Nation. They had a really good time laughing at me, with me, because of my pronunciation. So we all know Anishinaabemowin has a different kind of intonation, and you put emphasis on different syllables. There's certain letters that they have in Cree that we won't have in Anishinaabemowin. So that was a lot of fun, and we had some good laughs in doing this work with the elders. And what ultimately resulted was this beautiful beaded flower pattern that was gifted to the work, and is a traditional pattern from the Mississippic Cree Nation. So if people from the north of Manitoba see this, they'll know that it's specifically from that region. And they chose to represent their laws within that structure. On the next slide, you can see some of the work that we were doing, at their culture camp, working through different terminology, different concepts, I brought in a Cree linguist because I said, I'm butchering this language. We need to actually have someone who can spell this out and help us understand law through language, which is a key part of how we understand language. So stories, songs, language, all of these are parts of how we understand Anishinaabe law. And in the next slide, we see Stella Neff explaining the concept of Wahkohtowin, which very much at the center of the Cree legal order, which is relationships and the continuity of relationships over time. I really love what she taught us all about 7 generations. Often we think, and it's explained to us 7 generations into the future, but actually 7 generations, according to her teaching, is centering yourself, and 3 generations before you and 3 generations ahead of you. And that always continues. That set of 7 is always continuing. And that to have a rich and full life, you will have known 3 generations back. So you'll have known your great-grandparents, and that you will meet your great-grandchildren. That's a full and rich life. And if you have the opportunity to share in that 7 generations together, that you will have moved life forward. You will have given effect to life. And in the Cree language, chapan is the word for great-grandchild, and it's the word for great grandparent. So in that language, it actually tells you they are one and the same. They're the linking ends to that chain that is actually a circle. And of course, I can't do it as eloquently. That teaching, it belongs to Stella and her family, and it's part of her knowledge bundle. And she shared that with us in some videos that are on the Decolonizing Water website. And you can see some of those explanations of the different terminologies that are found within that flower that are part of the Cree laws. But I thought that was really an important thing to note, because language does have that power to tell us about our sets of responsibilities and relationships. Now on the next slide, we see the beautiful swag, the sweatshirts and I'll be in the mall in Winnipeg and I'll run into people and it's like, we head nod each other, right? We're so excited and we're wearing these beautiful shirts that represent that amazing work that was done by the nation. On the next slide, I have a video that I think I'll skip, but if you have some time within the conference, if you have a little break and you want to play it, it's a video of Chief Heidi Cook and Stella Neff talking about the importance of that work. I'll shift maybe to one kind of last thing that I wanted to talk about, and the one that is engaging what we're looking to with the water treaty. And you should see Lake Winnipeg Indigenous Collective on this slide, and they have been running a personhood project that we've been collaborating with them on for many years. And challenging this idea of, on the next slide, is water a person? What does that actually mean? And personhood has become very popularized internationally, but is it the right mechanism? Or what are the mechanisms by which we recognize personhood? What are the benefits and downfalls? Is it actually appropriate to recognize what Indigenous people refer to as spiritedness and agency of debate? So, wondering, is this the right mechanism? And on the next slide, you can see that the law and state law has made a lot of different possibilities for the recognition of personhood through legislation, settlements, jurisprudence, constitutional recognition, and then like bills of rights, bylaws, and that there are some Indigenous mechanisms for the recognition of personhood as well. And on the next slide, you can see some examples from around the world. I mean, this needs to be updated. I haven't done an update since 2021, but there's, dozens, if not hundreds of examples now of recognition of personhood and agency. And there are some that I talk about that are really generated from Indigenous approaches. And two key examples, I think, are the Klamath River Yurok Tribal Council resolution, so recognizing the river. And I love always talking about the rights of Minoman, but I won't do that today because you're the experts, and I'll just leave it at saying that I really like the approach, and it builds on some of that international approach about, inherent rights to exist and flourish and regenerate and evolve. And but those are, again, I think, reflections of what's contained within Anishinaabe law in itself. On the next slide, we have our first Canadian example of recognition of personhood through the Magpie River resolutions and bylaws. This is an interesting example, I think, because it's the first in Canada, but secondly, because it's done through an alliance, and the nation and the municipality issued sister resolutions. So they have different legal mechanisms. One is enacting a bylaw within their municipality. The other is doing it from Band Council resolution, which is the order of the First Nation government. And then they have the traditional guardians that are enforcing that. So they say the same thing, but they're done from different places of authority. And they sit side by side and kind of exercise that authority in different ways. It's also challenging because the federal and provincial government have not recognized this yet. So that's a big next effort that the Inuit Quanishit are working on. And we hosted them at the Nibi Gathering this year and tried to support the work that they do and learn from the important things that they're trying to achieve. So there's really different ways of doing that work, and we've been considering them in the Lake Winnipeg context. So on the next slide, you can see part of our water ceremony, and what we've done and what I've had the privilege of doing is to take some of the water from Lake Winnipeg and bring it to these different places where the water has recognized personhood, and to do an exchange and ask some of that water to come back with me and to be placed into Lake Winnipeg and to put that water into conversation. Because if we truly believe that water has a spirit and agency, and then it needs to have its own, it needs to make its own determinations. And we need to be responsive to that as humans. And we need to help in any way that we can, because that's our set of, that's part of our set of responsibilities and obligations. So this is work that we've done with the women of Niitsitapi and other nations around Lake Winnipeg. And what's been interesting is we've done these dialogues around the lake with the nations, the 14 nations, and they've decided not to pursue personhood, but rather to work on the water treaty. And that they want to really recognize spiritedness and agency from their own sets of obligations and responsibilities. And these are Cree and Anishinaabe people. So we're dealing in a multi-jurisdictional context already with the state governments, but also amongst the different nations. And so we're working on that, and we'll be hosting a series of dialogues and trying to build that. And I should note that, and this will be on our website soon, I had a conversation that we recorded with Leroy Little Bear, who's a Blackfoot scholar, and he and I were talking about their buffalo treaty. And so they have reintroduced the buffalo. Basically, I hate to summarize it, but the essence of it was like, how can we be Blackfoot if our keystone species, the one who tells us how to be in relationship with the land, is not here? And so they've done a lot of repatriation work and built this buffalo treaty, with the buffalo being part of the treaty, and saying, like, how do we meet our sets of responsibilities to you? So we're building a water treaty, kind of mirroring some of the good work that was done by the Blackfoot, who have brought in a bunch of allies, other nations, organizations, persons that support the Buffalo Treaty. And if we switch to the next slide, we're trying to promote some information about the Water Treaty and the Buffalo Treaty itself, which is celebrating 10 years now and has seen pretty significant reintroduction of buffalo within the territory, and building those alliances within the Lake Winnipeg watershed around that water treaty. Next slide. I put this here as, and if you want more information, you can email me, and I saw someone trying to take a picture of that slide. I didn't mind if we moved forward too quickly, but all of this should be on the Decolonizing Water website, and I'll give you a QR code in the last slide too. The next slide is a picture of my niece Lucy, and she was such a little peanut there. She's 14 and taller than me now. But she comes to the Nibi Gathering, and she has this very important relationship with water, and she's a great ambassador for that relationship. And she was wearing her Decolonizing Water hat in the playground as a little kid, and someone came up to her and said, "What does decolonizing water mean?" And my sister kind of took a step back, and she said, "Okay, I'm going to see how this plays out." And Lucy laid it all out. She said, "We don't really respect water in the way that we should, and we're made of water, just like 70 to 80%. And my sister thought, "Oh, how cool is that she has these stats at the tip of her finger?" She says, "I am water, and like if you treated me the way most people treat water, we'd all be in really big trouble." And she's like, "We are in trouble, and so we need to rethink like everything about how that relationship is it's not good." And my sister said she was sitting there just in absolute awe of this young child who just nailed it, right? She said, like, we have to do better. We have responsibilities, and it's all of us. And so I put this here because they're our ambassadors. They're the ones that are going to make big change, and we just have to help them with some of the tools to be able to do that. And I think that that's the work that work that you're taking on, within your nations, within your communities, in your territory. And I really want to thank you for that and say, it doesn't go unnoticed. Wish I was there to kind of shake each of your hands and say, carry on with that really good work. It's really beautiful. So hopefully some of these, examples that I've shared, some of this work that we're doing in our territory can bring some inspiration or comfort. On this last slide here, I have a QR code to our Decolonizing Water website and some of our funding sources and my website as well. Think that this is so necessary and timely. And I want to thank Joe for the invitation to come and be, come and sit with you and share a little bit, and really look forward to what comes next. So I'll say miigwech and ask if you have any questions or comments, and